Draw a line on a map and you draw a border. Draw a border and you divide not just land, but futures, possibilities, the very question of who gets to decide what happens next. The 49th parallel that separates the United States from Canada today looks inevitable in retrospect, as though geography itself insisted on it. But in 1846, that line was not inevitable at all. It was the result of two empires standing at a brink, both claiming the same territory, both willing to fight for it, and both discovering at the last moment that fighting would cost more than compromise. The story begins not in drawing rooms or in the halls of government, but in a landscape without order. Oregon Territory in the 1830s and 1840s was a place where sovereignty meant almost nothing. It stretched from the Pacific inland to the Rocky Mountains, and both Britain and the United States claimed it, each armed with historical argument, neither willing to cede an inch without forcing the other to justify why. The British case rested on fur trade. Since the late 1700s, British traders had moved through this land, establishing posts along the Columbia River, mapping the coastline, leaving their mark on the geography itself. They had names for the rivers and mountains. They had records. They had occupation, however sparse. The Hudson's Bay Company, that ancient monopoly, ran most of this enterprise. For Britain, Oregon was not a frontier to settle, but a frontier to exploit, to extract wealth and maintain leverage. Granting it away meant losing a foothold on the Pacific, and in an era when naval power meant global power, losing ground on any coast felt like losing the game itself. The American claim was younger, but more aggressive. Lewis and Clark had crossed the continent at the start of the century, reaching the Pacific at the mouth of the Columbia. That expedition had been celebrated as a triumph of American exploration, a proof that American settlers could reach and occupy land as well as any European power. More than that, Americans believed in something Britain had learned but tried to ignore, that settlers who came to build homes and farms had stronger claims than traders who came to extract and leave. Waves of American settlers began moving west in the 1840s. They did not come for beaver pelts. They came with families, with livestock, with the intention to stay. They saw Oregon as their inheritance, their promise, their manifest destiny. This is where the first loop begins, though it would not close for a decade. The question was not who had discovered Oregon first. Both sides had. The question was who had the right to it, and on what grounds. The British said occupation and trade. The Americans said exploration and settlement. Neither answer was entirely wrong. Neither was entirely right. And as long as both nations insisted their answer was the only one that mattered, compromise was invisible. Pressure built quietly at first. American settlers arrived in Oregon and established homesteads in the Willamette Valley, south of the Columbia River, where the soil was rich and the winters were bearable. British settlers were fewer and mostly worked for the Hudson's Bay Company, stationed at trading posts. The Americans, spread across the landscape and multiplying, had something Britain did not, presence that was hard to ignore and harder to remove. They were not temporary. They were not there to count beaver. They were there to build. By the early 1840s, the American government could not ignore what its own citizens were doing. Settlers were moving to Oregon in organized groups. Political pressure in Washington began to mount. The slogan emerged with almost perfect simplicity: 54, 40, or fight. The number referred to the latitude line at 54 degrees 40 minutes north, the boundary that the most aggressive American expansionists wanted to establish. That line would give the United States all of present-day British Columbia, pushing Britain entirely out of the Pacific Northwest. It was a stunning claim, presented not as a negotiating position, but as a demand wrapped in the language of national destiny. The rhetoric was new, and it changed the nature of the dispute. This was no longer a technical disagreement between governments about who had discovered a river first. This was a political assertion, backed by voters and settlers, that the United States had the right to expand to that line, and that compromising on that right would be a betrayal. Inside America, 5440 or fight became rallying cry and electoral platform. A candidate could run on it. A president could be elected on it. And in 1844, James K. Polk campaigned partly on that promise. Britain received this message with a mixture of alarm and careful calculation. Losing all of Oregon territory might be acceptable if it meant avoiding war. Losing territory north of 5440 would mean losing ground that Britain considered part of its Canadian possession. It was not the value of the land that mattered most. It was the precedent, the signal about whether Britain could still hold what it claimed when challenged by a rising power. The tension this created was unlike earlier disputes between nations. Both had navies. Both had armies that could be mobilized. Neither was a declining power that the other could simply absorb. They were peers in power, unequal in geography, but equal in will. And for the first time, Americans were organized not as scattered traders, but as settlers, making the dispute real in a way it had never been before. What happened next was preparation for rupture, though neither side initially understood it as such. Britain began quietly moving military resources closer to the disputed territory. Ships were positioned. Soldiers were concentrated at key points. The movement was defensive, meant to signal that Britain could defend what it claimed. But signals sent by one side are received by the other as threats. America, seeing this mobilization, understood it as confirmation that Britain was willing to fight. America began its own preparations. The colonists, meanwhile, became the hidden pressure point that neither government fully controlled. American settlers in Oregon were not waiting for their government to decide what they should do. They were already there, already occupying land, already building communities. British traders were fewer and more scattered. In any conflict, the Americans held ground advantage. They were distributed across the territory they claimed. The British presence was concentrated at a few trading posts. This asymmetry in actual occupation was something both governments understood, though it would take time for that understanding to shift policy. By 1845 and 1846, the dispute had reached the point where continued delay seemed worse than a decision, even if the decision was confrontation. In Washington, the Polk administration was under pressure to make good on its campaign promises. In London, the government was under pressure to defend British interests. Both sides talked of firmness, of standing their ground, of not backing down to American bluster or British arrogance, depending on which side one asked. But something was happening beneath the surface of the public rhetoric. Diplomats and military planners on both sides were doing calculations. The calculations did not lead to optimism about war. An American invasion of Canada across the border would be possible, but it would be long and difficult and expensive. A British defense of Oregon territory from across an ocean, fighting settlers who had every incentive to resist, would be even more difficult. Britain had lost colonies before. It had the naval power to make a war costly for America, but it did not have the geographic advantage. America had thousands of potential soldiers in the territory itself. Britain would have to send soldiers across an ocean to fight in unfamiliar terrain against opponents who had motivation and proximity on their side. The economic calculations cut deeper. Britain in 1846 was the industrial engine of the world, and its power rested on trade and finance, not primarily on territorial conquest. War with America would disrupt that trade catastrophically. American grain fed British workers. American cotton fed British textile mills. Disrupting that commerce for a territory that Britain did not actually need, that produced no great wealth, that was a complication rather than a core strategic interest. The calculation began to shift. And on the American side, similar logic applied. War with Britain would disrupt not just trade, but the entire project of westward expansion. The American economy was tied to British investment and credit. Open conflict would sever those ties. The settlers moving to Oregon wanted land, opportunity, the ability to build wealth. They did not want to be soldiers. War would delay everything they were trying to accomplish. Neither government stated this calculation openly. Public rhetoric remained firm. But in the background, diplomats began to ask a different question. Not whether one side could win, but whether winning was worth what it would cost. And once that question is asked, compromise becomes possible. The solution, when it emerged, was almost geometrically simple. The 49th parallel had been established as the border between the United States and British Canada to the east in the Treaty of 1818. It was already proven as a boundary, already accepted by both sides in that context. Extending it westward to the Pacific would divide Oregon Territory. It would not give either side what they claimed they wanted. It would give the Americans territory south and west of the line, including the Willamette Valley, where settlers had already established themselves. It would give Britain territory north and west, including present-day British Columbia and the valuable northern portions of the Columbia River system. Neither side would call this a victory, but both sides could call it a conclusion. Both sides could explain to their constituents that they had held firm and extracted the best possible terms. The Americans would keep the land their settlers had already occupied. Britain would keep the northern territories that had been less attractive to settlement, but strategically important for the fur trade and naval positioning. The line would be straight, easily demarcated, impossible to dispute once drawn. The story of how that solution was reached is the story of pressure meeting calculation, of public rhetoric meeting private necessity, of two governments discovering that their interests, while not identical, were compatible enough that compromise was the better path. But that story belongs to what comes next, to the negotiations that followed, to the moment when the line was drawn and a new border came into being. The 49th parallel was not inevitable. It was chosen because it worked, and it worked because both sides had run out of better options. The British position had always been defensive. They held the northern territories through the Hudson's Bay Company, which had operated trading posts in the region since the late 1600s. The company's claim was old, but its presence was thin. Fur traders moved through the landscape. They did not settle it the way Americans were settling it. By the 1840s, the British understood something crucial about the map they were trying to defend. It was becoming impossible to hold what you could not occupy. The American position was aggressive, but it was also constrained. The slogan, 54-40 or fight, had won elections. It had mobilized voters, energized newspapers, and created a political debt that could not simply be erased when diplomacy required flexibility. President James K. Polk had campaigned on expansion. His party had staked its legitimacy on westward growth. But Polk was also a pragmatist. He had inherited a government divided between those who wanted war and those who understood that war would cost more than compromise ever could. What neither government could ignore was what was already happening on the ground. American settlers were moving into Oregon Territory in numbers that increased every year. They were not waiting for their government to resolve a legal dispute. They were building farms, claiming land, establishing communities. By 1845, there were perhaps 5,000 American settlers in the Willamette Valley alone. British settlers numbered in the hundreds. The disparity was stark. It was also irreversible. The Hudson's Bay Company understood this better than anyone. The company's representatives in the territory reported regularly to London. They did not use the language of optimism. They reported facts. American settlers were arriving in wagon trains. They were claiming the best agricultural land. They were establishing local governments. The company's trading posts could not compete with this kind of occupation. Trading posts were commercial nodes. Settlements were assertions of sovereignty. In London, the British government faced a calculation that looked different on paper than it did in political reality. On paper, Britain had resources. The Royal Navy was unmatched. British industrial capacity dwarfed that of any rival. But on paper did not mean much when the calculation involved a war fought 3,000 miles away. in a region of minimal strategic value to the empire's core interests. Britain's power depended on naval dominance and control of crucial trading routes. Oregon Territory was neither. It was fur, timber, and agricultural potential. Valuable, but not vital. The deeper calculation involved India, China, and the balance of power in Europe. Britain could not afford to tie up significant military resources in a distant territorial dispute when other threats were more pressing. The calculus of empire was not simple arithmetic. It was priority and resources. And Oregon Territory, however much the Hudson's Bay Company valued it, was not a priority. In Washington, the calculation pointed in a different direction, but toward the same conclusion. American expansion was driving policy, but expansion worked best when it was not impeded by conflict with other major powers. A war with Britain would be catastrophic for American economic interests. Trade between the two nations was growing. American merchants relied on access to British capital, British markets, and the protection of British naval power on the high seas. War would destroy all of that. There was another factor that neither side discussed openly, but both understood. If this dispute became a shooting war, it would validate a dangerous principle. It would suggest that territorial disputes between great powers were resolved by military force rather than negotiation. Both Britain and America benefited from a world in which there were rules, conventions, and mechanisms for settling disagreements. A war over Oregon would undermine those mechanisms. It would create precedent for conflicts elsewhere, in places where the stakes might be far higher. By 1846, both governments had begun the real work of negotiation. It was delicate, because both had to satisfy domestic audiences that expected firmness. Americans had heard 54-40 or fight. They had invested emotionally in the idea of a vast Western territory. British citizens had heard assurances that their nation would not be pushed around by an upstart republic. Both governments had to produce a result that could be packaged as success rather than surrender. The negotiators understood that this required a solution that was neither pure compromise nor anything resembling a victory for either side. They needed something that looked like a principled boundary, something that could be explained to voters and parliaments as the natural, inevitable line rather than a negotiated retreat. The 49th parallel offered exactly that. It was already established. It already divided British and American territory to the east. It was a straight line, geometric and rational. It could be presented as the logical extension of an existing boundary rather than a new concession. For Americans, it gave them the Willamette Valley, where their settlers already lived. For Britain, it gave them the northern territories that mattered more to the fur trade and naval positioning than the southern valleys did. The British government moved first toward acceptance. In early 1846, the British Foreign Secretary offered the Americans a boundary at the 49th parallel. It was presented not as a compromise, but as a reasonable solution that reflected the actual distribution of settlement and interest on the ground. The Americans, who had been prepared for rejection, instead found agreement. On June 15, 1846, the Treaty of Oregon was signed. The line was drawn. It would run from the Rocky Mountains to the Pacific, following the 49th parallel. It was not what either side had claimed it wanted. It was exactly what both sides could actually accept. The treaty's ratification was quick. There was no celebration, but there was relief. The newspapers that had been printing talk of war shifted their attention to other stories. The settlers in the Willamette Valley learned that they would remain in American territory. The Hudson's Bay Company learned that it would need to consolidate its operations north of the new line. Political leaders in both nations explained the result to their constituents as a victory, because politically they had to. But privately, in diplomatic correspondence and in the internal communications of both governments, the tone was different. Both sides understood that they had done what was necessary. Both understood that this boundary would hold because it was practical, because it reflected something real about where people actually lived and what they actually valued, and because both governments had chosen pragmatism over pride. The line on the map was drawn. It looked inevitable, as if it had always been waiting to be discovered. But it had not been inevitable. It had been chosen, negotiated, and accepted because the alternative was unacceptable to everyone who had the power to make the choice. That is how borders are truly made. The line held. 180 years after the Treaty of Oregon was signed, that boundary at the 49th parallel remained exactly where two diplomats and their governments had agreed it would be. No war came to erase it. No subsequent negotiation revised it. No colonial power marched north or south to reclaim what had been surrendered at the UB negotiating table. To understand why this matters, you have to understand what almost happened instead. The moment the treaty became law, something shifted in how Americans and British thought about their relationship. They had stood at the precipice of a conflict that would have been unlike anything either nation had experienced in their own hemisphere. The Royal Navy had ruled Atlantic waters for generations, but in the Pacific Northwest, the terrain was different. The distances were vast. Supply lines stretched thousands of miles. An American force fighting on its own continent would have advantages that money and ships could not overcome. British military strategists understood this with a clarity that politicians sometimes resisted. A war in Oregon would not be won quickly. It would not be won cheaply. And it would not be won while Britain faced other obligations around the world. The Crimean War lay in the future, but chronic tensions with Russia, ongoing complications in India, and the need to maintain naval supremacy across every ocean meant that resources were already spread thin. To gamble a significant portion of military strength on a remote territory that was geographically difficult to reinforce was to invite disaster elsewhere. American strategists saw something different, but arrived at a similar conclusion through a different door. A war with Britain would be catastrophic for American commerce. Trade with the British Empire and British territories represented an enormous portion of American economic activity. Shipping would be disrupted. Credit markets would freeze. The financial systems of both nations were already intertwined in ways that neither could easily untangle. A military conflict would damage both economies, but the American economy, younger and more fragile, would suffer more acutely. This was never said openly during the negotiations. Public rhetoric remained fierce. Newspapers continued to publish maps showing American territory extending all the way to 54 degrees and 40 minutes north latitude. Politicians continued to invoke the Monroe Doctrine as though it had granted Americans the entire Western continent. But behind closed doors, the mathematics of war had already been calculated. Both sides had already begun the quiet process of admitting to themselves that their true interests did not require the destruction of the other. What changed everything was a single shift in British policy. Lord Aberdeen, the British Prime Minister, made a decision that would shape decades of British-American relations. He instructed the British negotiators to make an offer. The offer was simple: accept the 49th parallel as the boundary. It was not the boundary Britain wanted. The boundary Britain wanted extended further south, protecting more territory and maintaining a stronger position on the Pacific coast. But Aberdeen understood something that military planners and trade ministers alike had come to accept. A boundary accepted by both parties was worth more than a boundary that required war to defend. The American negotiators received this proposal with a mixture of disappointment and relief. They had hoped for the entire territory. They had campaigned on the entire territory. But they also understood that their government had already begun to shift. The election that had been fought on the promise of 54-40, or fight, was already fading into the past. A new administration was in place. The new administration wanted a settlement. The new administration understood that a nation that had already acquired Texas, that was already looking toward California, that already controlled the lands between the Mississippi and the Rocky Mountains, could afford to accept that one boundary would have to be shared. The negotiation itself, when it came down to the final stages, was almost anticlimactic. Both sides had already done the real work of persuading themselves that this was necessary. What remained was the formal process of translating necessity into documents that both governments could sign. There is a particular quality to the moment when two powers agree to stop competing for something. It is not triumph. It is not defeat. It is recognition. Both parties recognize that the cost of continued competition exceeds the value of what is being competed for. Both parties recognize that they can achieve their fundamental objectives without destroying the other. Both parties recognize that the relationship itself has become more valuable than the specific territory under dispute. This recognition does not always come easily, and it does not always last. But in the case of Oregon, it came at exactly the right moment. Had the negotiation been delayed another year, the pressure from settlers in the territory might have forced a military confrontation before diplomacy could work. Had the negotiation come earlier, before both sides had fully calculated the cost of war, pride might have prevented compromise. The timing, in retrospect, looks almost providential, but it was not providence. It was simply that the moment when rationality could override ambition had finally arrived. When the treaty was ratified, when the boundary was officially established, when the maps were redrawn to show the new international line at 49 degrees north latitude, something else became possible. The two powers could now cooperate instead of compete. They could trade without suspicion. They could expand their empires in different directions without worrying that the other would stab them in the back over a contested territory. The very act of compromise made trust possible. The line on the map became more than a boundary. It became a statement. It said that two competing powers could coexist. It said that competition did not have to lead to war. It said that the rational calculation of mutual benefit could override the romantic appeals of national expansion and imperial destiny. In the years that followed, that boundary became one of the longest undefended borders in the world. No military installations were built along the 49th parallel. No fortifications were constructed. No armies were stationed to guard against invasion. Instead, the boundary became a line of trust, a line that both parties had agreed to respect, and then simply had respected. This is what almost did not happen. This is what might have been replaced by conflict, by bloodshed, by the emergence of a militarized frontier that would have shaped North America very differently. The line at 49 degrees north latitude is a monument to pragmatism. It is a reminder that even in the age of empire, even when national pride was at stake, even when politicians had made public declarations about what their nations would defend, compromise was possible. And when compromise was possible, both sides chose it. The parallel runs east to west across the continent. It divides what is now Canada from what is now the United States. It has held for nearly 2 centuries. It continues to hold, and it will likely continue to hold as long as both nations recognize what their negotiators understood in 1846, that some things matter more than territory, and that the line on the map is less important than the peace that surrounds it.